Hey everybody, I wanted to do a part 2 to our best soil for citrus video because I feel like there's still a lot more we can talk about and a lot more I want to show you, especially at this time of year, because in the winter time you might deal with issues like root rot a bit more than normal depending on what type of gardener you are. Now I found for me in particular, I'm the type of gardener who tends to overlove plants and thus overwater them. And that can be dangerous when you're dealing with citrus here, because in the wintertime, their metabolism slows down. These plants start to go to sleep and slow down growing a lot. And because of that, they aren't taking up as much water and nutrients as they normally are. And this even goes for an indoor environment. So in the wintertime, you not only tend to deal with the most diseases and pests like spider mites, but you also have to deal with the issue of overwatering your citrus because they simply don't need as much water and your mix is going to be staying wet a lot longer. Now, this is also a problem with a lot of commercial potting mixes and other mixes you might be using because a lot of them have a high concentration of organic ingredients, particularly peat moss, wood compost, wood chips, things of that nature that will break down and also hold onto a lot of water, which then creates an anaerobic environment, in which case you get root rot and the citrus are not happy. So a very important thing when taking care of these plants is keeping their roots healthy, and that's probably the most important thing I had to learn when I was trying to learn how to take care of citrus plants. I killed a lot before I got this right, so I want to help you guys get it right a little bit sooner than I did. So learning how to water is important, but learning how to make a proper mix that kind of works together with your watering habits is also really important. So we want a free draining aerobic mix, so a lot of oxygen in that soil there. And we also want, ideally, a predominantly mineral-based mix with a lot of inorganic materials. So you can see what I have in front of me here is perlite, sand, and peat moss. And these make up the base of pretty much most of the soil mixes I make nowadays. Unless it's something I'm selling in a shorter period of time where I might use a 50-50 mix of peat moss and pine bark, I otherwise prefer to use the perlite, sand, and peat moss because I can create a semi-permanent mix that doesn't have to be changed much at all because we really only have to worry about the peat moss breaking down. As for these other ingredients, they are basically there forever. They will never break down. So when it comes to using these ingredients in different mixes, I have two preferred mixes that I like to use either for our more permanent potted plants or for our nursery plants. So they have slightly different functions and slightly different ratios of perlite, sand, and peat moss. Now, the one on the right here in this pot, this is a 1:1:1 ratio of the perlite, sand, and peat moss. So equal parts of all of those ingredients, and you can tell just by looking at it, it looks like a good mix that's going to drain well, and the plants are going to be happy in it. And now, all of the plants that we plan on keeping in their pots a little bit more permanently, maybe pruning them and dealing with them a little bit less, basically our balcony plants that we have at home, we like to put them in this mix. And it's not quite as heavy as the topsoil that you can also plant your plants in, but it is still quite heavy, being 1/3 sand. So that is also a consideration, but you can play around with these ratios. Because the other mix that we have, which is more for our nursery plants, this is, probably more like a 2:2:1 ratio of peat moss, perlite, and then sand. So sand is the 1, and peat moss and perlite are the 2. So it's a higher proportion of peat moss and perlite with a little bit of sand in there. And now what I find is that plants tend to grow a little bit quicker and fill out a little faster in this mix as opposed to the denser mix here. But plants can stay in this a bit longer and that slower growth may actually be better in some instances. But for nursery purposes, we do want fast-growing plants, and it helps that this mix is a bit lighter too, which is great when we're transporting a lot of plants. Now, the downside to these mixes is that being that they're inorganic, organic fertilizers tend not to be very effective. And you may notice with some plants, this is in a different mix, but it's actually representative of what you might see, the contrast between these two plants. This is a plant here where you would expect this pretty normal, healthy growth in an inorganic medium, like what we're showing you guys here, but also being fertilized inorganically, so with some sort of liquid or slow-release chemical fertilizers. Plants that look like this, a little bit more deficient, a little lighter, maybe not getting as much nitrogen. This is what you might see trying to use organic fertilizers in an inorganic mix. Because essentially we're starting off with no life in this soil that we're making here. So there's not much to really help you break down those nutrients and make them available to these plants. So what I prefer to use is either a slow-release fertilizer like Madison Citrus Nurseries. They have a 1366, so it's pretty high nitrogen, and that works great, and it's slow-release, and you barely have to think about it. But I also prefer to use Citrus Jax, which I think is a 20-10-20, and that works really good too. And that one's a liquid form, so you do have to be careful with how much you use. And I err on the side of caution, where I tend to use less rather than more and see how the plant reacts. But I believe Herschel from Madison Citrus Nursery even said, I mean, you got to try really hard to over-fertilize these plants. You don't have to put a lot of effort into fertilizing. You could fertilize a little bit, see how the plant reacts. If it's not dark enough, if it's not growing good enough, you can then add a bit more fertilizer. But I did also have these plants here for display to show you guys some of the different mixes that we've tried in the past and some different ratios and kind of how these plants grew in them. Now, some of these have been in this longer than others, so this isn't a perfectly equal comparison, but I thought it was a cool perspective to see. Now, this first one on the left here is a calamondin plant, which looks like it's starting to get girdled here a little bit. We did have a rodent in the greenhouse. But it was growing in actually a mix that was 50-50 between sand and the cheapest potting mix I could find at Lowe's. So it was very heavily wood-based, and then the other half was sand. It did have some sort of slow-release fertilizer, and the calamondins on average were growing okay, but they just don't look as healthy as a lot of our other plants were. And we did have some plants that just basically refused to grow in this mix. It was a bit too heavy, a bit too wood-based, and the plants did not like it. Now this yuzu over here, this little seedling that we have left, actually one of the scrawnier ones because we sold most of the rest. This is in a mix that is probably similar to our 2-to-1 ratio. However, it has less perlite. So this one's probably more like a 3-to-1 with peat moss, perlite, and sand. But the roots are quite healthy, and I didn't have to water it much because it was heavier in peat moss. And that's something to remember when you have a more moisture retentive mix, so a mix higher in peat moss or coconut. You want to adjust your watering habit and water less because it's going to hold on to that moisture a lot longer. So you have to adjust, ease back on the watering, and give it some time to really dry out before you water again. Now on the right here, this is an extremely mineral-based mix. I think this even has vermiculite in it. But this is something like equal fractions of topsoil, sand, perlite, vermiculite, and peat moss. It's some crazy mix I threw together just because I had a bunch of leftover of everything. But this plant, this is a swingle citramelo, and it actually grew great in there. You can see it's actually ready for a new pot basically, as it's starting to circle a little bit there. But those roots are thick and healthy. I absolutely love the mix, and the leaves don't look as great now because it's just that time of year. But this plant grew really well, and very vigorously. But the vigor, that's just the species itself. Swingle citramelo is a very fast grower. But the mineral-based mix worked really well for it, and it's continued to work well for a lot of other plants. So it is a mix that I prefer now. I do like to use this in instances where we're not using topsoil, or again, if it's for a potted plant that's going inside our home, or if it's on our balcony and we don't want anything excessively heavy. This is a bit lighter, and having the peat moss and everything in it, it drains well and holds onto nutrients very well too. So I think regardless of which one you want to use, or play around with the ratios, I don't really think you can get this wrong unless you made it like all peat moss. But within reason, different ratios of peat moss, perlite, and sand have all tended to work pretty well for me. I found it kind of harder to mess up, and even a mix like this that I would think is less ideal, where it has more peat moss than the other ingredients, it still worked okay, and I didn't kill this plant in it, which is really great, because again, it does hold on to more water, and especially going into this time of year, you have to be very careful. And I pretty much stopped watering these plants unless I start to see signs that they're dehydrated, which you would look for the leaves curling. So it looks something like that all across the plant, and you might see more tender growth starting to droop and fall down. But you can see in this case with these plants here, they're all perfectly hydrated, despite the fact that if I look at this, I'm like, ooh, that feels pretty dry. But in fact, there's still, and even for this one, by weight it's okay, but by feel it feels pretty dry, and you might want to water it. But the plants are still doing okay. And in some cases, especially if you're learning how to water, sometimes it's better to see the sign of dehydration first and then water. And as you get more experienced, you can water them before they reach that droopy level, because when they do, any new growth may actually fall off, and it may slow down the rate of growth of your plants. So if you want them to continue growing and grow healthy, you do want to water appropriately and not wait until they're completely dehydrated. But that's just a little aside about watering. I find it's helpful if you're not too experienced with it. But again, when you're making your own soil mixes here, if you're using a well-aerated mineral-based mix, I think more often than not, you're going to have some success. And I do think this works a lot better than anything you can buy. And you can obtain these ingredients pretty cheap. I mean, I get these in bulk bags, probably 3 cubic feet each. Perlite's probably $30 for around 3 cubic feet. Peat moss, you can actually get even more than that for around $25-30. And then the sand, probably around $15 for that price. So you'd be looking at around $75 for over 10 cubic feet of potting mix, and at that really high quality stuff. All you have to do after that is fertilize, and you are good to go. But I will be potting up some plants in this now. I have some rooted lime quat cuttings that are ready to go and ready to grow on healthy in this mix. I had some plants I started in this mix that I want to actually transplant them over to this mix, because again, this one wasn't so great. Can't recommend doing that. I have actually done that with Miracle Grow, just their normal potting mix. Mixed it 50-50 with sand, and that actually worked good. But with the Lowe's, I forget if it was like the Stog, STA Green brand or one of those, it was a really, really cheap mix. I can't recommend that. I would definitely spend a little more if you're going to go the 50-50 potting mix and sand route. It can work with the right potting mix, but not the really cheap ones. So you'd want to start with a mix that already kind of looked more peat moss and perlite-y, like the Miracle Grow mixes, and then you can add a bit of sand, and it can help you stretch out that otherwise expensive potting mix, and then you can just fertilize from there to make up for any loss of nutrients that was in the pre-made mix. But I hope this is helpful for you guys. Let me know if you have any more questions or if there's anything else we could discuss on this topic here. I do think there probably is more to talk about in the future, so I'd love to hear from you guys, and if there's any particular struggles you have, be it with your citrus or with your soil mixes for any of your other fruit trees, feel free to let me know in the comments. But if this was helpful, do please like the video and subscribe, because we will have more helpful content in the future. So thank you guys for joining me as always, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.